Oh yes. Oh! I got this recently, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. This one is just so beautifully illustrated. And this is not a review, or this is not talking about the actual poem itself. I could talk about the artwork on its own, but in the introduction, and this book was written 1947, although this particular one was 1971, the reprint. Think about that. It was written just after the war, and then it was almost 30 years later when it got the third printing. It's amazing. And what really delighted me was the artwork that comes with this book. But as I started to look through it, it became apparent that I needed to do one-off episode on just the foreword. It was rendered first into English sometime in the 19th century by Edward Fitzgerald. But this is edited by George Mayne and the illustrations by Robert Stewart Sheriffs. I'll show you another one of the beautiful illustrations since I've just mentioned him. Look at that. Wonderful artwork. I'd love to do artwork like that for the thumbs I do. So I've been doing the Bhagavad Gita and Homer, the Iliad. And it's apparent that, and I've said so before, when you're reading it generally in modern English. But it wasn't written in modern English. And therefore you lose a lot of meaning because there is no equivalent word or phrase from one kind of ancient language into modern English. It just can't be done. And that's what's talked about here. And it's about the translation of the Rubaiyat. And I don't think I'm pronouncing that word correct. So George Mayne talks a lot about the translation process, that the poem made so little mark on its first appearance. For the translator of poetry and vision always stands between us and the original. The original would be completely different if you was to read it in the original language, which was a form of Arabic of around about, I think, 11th century. And whatever the beauty or the exact meaning of the original may have been, and I'm reading from this, in this case we can hardly doubt that for English minds the translator has given to it a reconciling beauty and flavour of his own, or her, which make it more acceptable to all but scholars or pedants. So if you don't like translations of books, according to Mr. Mayne, you're a pedant. Fitzgerald's amended form of the opening stanza with his original will give an example. So what he does, he gives versions of the Rubaiyat. You've got the first edition, and then the poem is actually rendered again as the second edition, and then the fifth, and they're all different. So over time, Edward Fitzgerald amended what he considered to be the words of the original put into English. So here's the example, and forgive me, you're just going to have to listen to me talking. This is the earlier version. Awake, for morning in the bowl of night has flung the stone that puts the stars to flight, and lo, the hunter of the east has caught the sultan's turret in a noose of light. So that's the original. And then he amends it to this. Wake, for the sun behind yon eastern height has chased the session of the stars from night, and to the field of heavens ascending strikes the sultan's turret with a shaft of light. That's not the same poem. So, awake for the morning and the bowl of night is nothing like wake for the sun behind yon eastern height. What is also given in this introduction are just two simple sentences. Dreaming, when dawn's left hand was in the sky, becomes changed to a more graceful but more ordinary, before the phantom of false morning died. So, when you read this, or any book, even the Bible, you've got to be careful, because whole meanings can be changed. And I don't think it's deliberate, although in the case of Fitzgerald, I'm beginning to think it is, or it was. because they are so discordant with each other. They're so diametrically opposed, so different. This is the editor, George F. Main, saying this. Never forget in reading a translation of Homer or Dante that it is a translation, and that we are listening at a far remove to a school of thought much more alien in its mode of expression than the skillful artifice of this version allows us to feel. We can never, therefore, get any true understanding of the likes of Homer if we're only reading the English. And I've always admired the stories of how you read of, say, an academic who wanted to understand the words of something, so he went out and learned the language so he could do it. I've never done that. I would love to do it. I'd love to do that now. And I think, if I'm correct, Shonin on Shonin's shelf is setting himself the task of learning. Is it Greek? Shonin, have I got that right? Apologise if it's wrong. For all its suavity and grace, this gospel of flesh versus spirit, coming in the midst of that very church-going Victorian age, should by its content, one might think, have caused a shock almost as great as Darwin's Origin of Species or Swinburne's Poems and Ballads. When Fitzgerald did his version, the English version of the Rubaiyat, for the first time the English-speaking world was exposed to it, and they were left uncaring. Editor is saying here it should have had a major impact, but it didn't. And though for the time thrown down into the rubble of the second-hand book box, price 1 penny, that'll be great, wouldn't it, if you've come across books at 1 penny or 1 cent, as a thing too insignificant for notice, its significance grew more apparent as time went on, and when it touches its centenary in 1959, it will almost certainly have lasted better than In Memoriam. For those two poems appeared at a time when, while religious convention was still rampant, religious belief was beginning to seek new supports for the faith that was in it, though the outlook which is now called modernist had scarcely begun. It's a reminder, and I'm mindful of Philip, and A Poet Reads to Write, because he talks a lot about the versions that he has of, say, Beowulf and whatever, and it's obvious that they have different connotations, different meaning, different use of language. So when we say, I've read Homer and I know it, I've now learned, or it's been reinforced, no, I don't. I only know the editor or the translator's version of that work. The flow of the words. And it's not just the words, it's what's behind those words. So if you are reading a book and it mentions, say, the Gay Gordons, or I was having a gale time at Claridge's, if you don't know the meaning of that word, you're completely misunderstanding what's being said. Well, that's the same with everything then. So whoever did the various translations are bringing to bear their understanding of certain words. And they may be academic, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily correct. So I find it fascinating, very useful. And what this book does, and I'll be talking about this when I come to talk about the book, is the first edition, Awake for the Morning and the Bowl of Night, which is then changed for the second edition when it was printed to Wake for the Sun Behind Yon Eastern Height, to the fifth edition, Wake for the Sun Who Scattered into Flight. Wow. So the Rubaiyat, I just felt urged to talk about this. And obviously, those people who will generally comment, you no doubt already know this, but I didn't realise it was so pronounced. This book contains the first, second and fifth editions in full, together with the textual variants in the third and fourth editions, thus providing the reader with a complete rendition of Fitzgerald's work on the Rubaiyat over a period of more than 25 years. Amazing. Look forward to reading it. And judging by the thickness of the pages, I don't think the poem's that big, that long. So here we go. Translations, beware. Ta-ta for now.